Welcome back to another episode of Uncut with Lucia. On today's episode, we are speaking with Deborah Herman. Deborah is a publisher, spiritual teacher, speaker, and author. Her latest book, Spiritual Writing from Inspiration to Publication, is out now. So, Deborah, welcome to Uncut with me, Lucia.
Oh, thank you for having me. Very excited to be on the show.
Me too. I'm very happy to have you back. I
Yeah, we've taken a ride together in the past, and I love talking with authors. That's my purpose, one of my missions in life.
Deborah, you went to law school at the age 20.
Yes,
Yeah, that's correct.
yes.
But then you transitioned into becoming an author and also a publisher. So what led your decision to change your career path?
Oh my gosh. Well, I go into that in more detail in my book because it was a very circuitous path, and people who've survived first year law school typically don't change their careers, even though I found out later a lot of my colleagues wished they had, because the practice of law for some people is just not what your fantasy is of what it's going to be like. Fortunately for me, when I did practice for a while, it was trial law, which I loved, and I switched into a dual degree with the Graduate School of Journalism right after my first year of law school because several things converged. One, I found out a family secret, and I'm writing a book about it. Um, Even though it was so many years ago, I'm finally, I've developed the skills and done the research to write about this story. But I also had started writing as just kind of a hobby. My brother was an amateur comedian. Comedy clubs were popping up everywhere, and I would go and just to maintain sanity. And the owner of the club said, you're here all the time. You don't drink enough to earn your keep. I'm putting you in a job. And he had me start to interview the comedians and do personality profiles for an entertainment magazine. I fell in love with it. I fell in love with learning about people's lives. And at the time, this will date my age, but at the time, I interviewed people like Paul Reiser, who later became very famous, and had his own TV series and movies and all of that before he was even known by anybody. I mean, we used to all go out at 2 a.m. to this place called Western Pancakes, and they would try out their bits. And it was really, and Dave Coulier was, I interviewed him before he was on Full House, and he was brilliant. So I got to understand their creative process. And of course, to this day, I have a love of an appreciation of comedy. But I also learned how to ask questions. So that's followed through with my writing career. And ultimately, I mean, the fact that I became a literary agent. I've written 13 published books and then ultimately became a publisher. That all happened because of changes in the industry, and seeing my husband, who is a literary agent, we were seeing books that would have sold years ago just not being picked up by the so-called Big Five for various reasons. So I created this smaller indie publishing house to accommodate some of these authors who were, looking for a different way of publishing. Does that
Yeah,
answer your question?
I was thinking about the experience you had in this pub or in this bar, this place you were telling us. And it's so fascinating. I think I would like to change my career as well after having this kind of experience. And Deborah, switching careers used to be more challenging. in the past?
Oh, nobody.
No?
Plus, I was awakening spiritually. And I also at first opened a holistic center. I was on television, doing spiritual counseling for people. Everybody thought I had completely lost my mind. But, as I say in the book, when you have a calling that's so strong, you'll face, at least it's one of the lessons that I talk about in the book, 7 lessons, you will withstand this criticism because no matter what, in your heart, there's no other path. And you have to follow wherever this journey is going to lead you. And that was also happening at the same time. So it was just a combination of so many things. I was just fortunate to be young enough to be able to switch and change my education path. And, it was so creative on the part of the law school and the journalism school to let me do that and take my electives from each program in the other school. So they were wonderful. I went to Ohio State. And I think the journalism school, they probably thought I was, going to become, I don't know what they thought. I studied literary journalism, which is creative nonfiction now is what we call it. And that was it. I was hooked. But I think the law school thought I was going to go into like First Amendment and intellectual property law. But no, that wasn't my path.
I don't see you
No.
practicing
No,
intellectual law.
no, I mean, it's good. I know about it and it's helped me, to in my work as a publisher and as an agent. But truly, I had an advisor when I was an undergraduate, and even he said at the time, he said, "You're a people person. You have the ability to be a scholar, but that's not for you. You're gonna need to be creative. So he was very astute. He understood his students at the time, that I was not going to be even though I do tremendous amounts of research for the books that I write, he saw that I wasn't going to want to be, just a researcher. So, you gotta follow who you are and stay true to that. That's your path. So I had to follow, but my path is like ziggy and zaggy, so I don't recommend that for everybody.
Yeah, exactly. I can say that I'm one of those who made the change and do not regret.
Sure. You're a great example. I mean, you're so creative and you also have a way of bringing out other people's stories that I think is just amazing. I mean, if we really want to be uncut, I'd like to share that I wasn't exactly prepared for our interview this morning when I realized, but I quickly dashed off and got ready. But I was very excited to have the opportunity to be interviewed by you again because you are, I'd like to say, really not only an interviewer, but you're a professional listener and are very present when you're interviewing your guests. And that's a real gift.
Thank you.
So,
It is a
you're
gift.
welcome.
Thank you. And Deborah, you are an spiritual teacher. And I was fascinated when I interviewed you the first time. And as a spiritual teacher, you write about spirituality in your book.
Yes.
So when did your belief in spirituality begin? I forgot to ask you last time, but now.
So this is okay. So we're getting the things we forgot because we just had such a wonderful conversation. I'm blessed because I believe I was born with a sense of otherworldly things. And I was blessed to be in a family where, even though it caused a few embarrassing situations, my parents were supportive of the idea that, people could have visions, people, that there is life beyond this world. I tell a few stories in the book about, how my mother, when I was really young, told me about an experience she had where she was in a boating accident, and she was the woman next to her, they were like 16, I guess. The woman next to her was killed, but my mother experienced being pushed away from a propeller. She physically felt pushed away, and she survived. And later saw this very concerned woman just looking at her. And then when she described, but there was nobody there. So when she described the woman to her mother and aunts, they were crying and they said, "That's our mother." And their mother died 2 weeks before my mother was born, and she was named for her. So I had that story in my, database from a very early age. I made the mistake of telling that story in a classroom, and was told, by the teacher, "I don't think you should tell that story." But I always had a sense of the otherworldly. I became overtly interested in the spiritual path when I was in law school. My experiences were accelerating. And I think that will happen when someone is ready to embrace this other part of themselves, because I believe everybody has these types of gifts, or maybe they're latent, maybe my brain is just wired a little differently. But I did notice that my experiences were accelerating. I'd see someone's face in my mind's eye, and then they'd call 5 minutes later. I would envision my cat. As I was sleeping, I'd wake up, the cat would be like right over my my face, and I'd seen a picture of the cat opening the cabinet and getting food, so things like that, where it's like, wait, that's rather non-coincidental. Mm-hmm. So those telepathic gifts and dreams and all kinds of things were starting to happen. And then I met, as I describe in the book, and I'm not plugging the book. It's just that I've written about these things because they were significant to me. Although if you want to buy the book, I wouldn't object. But I decided to take singing lessons while I was in law school again, so I would maintain sanity. And I met the husband of my vocal instructor. He was elderly, he was in a wheelchair. And one day he just came up to me and he showed me a poem that was very mystical that he had written. And he handed me a book. In fact, my magic bookshelf. Here's the book. Uh-huh. Now, this was back in the late 70s, early 80s. I'm telling you, I'm a little bit older than a lot of, but I'm still kicking.
Yeah. So this book is from this.
This is the book. Now, I don't know if this was, I know I ordered a copy. This may not be the exact one that he gave me, but it is his book. He self-published it. Very few of these are around. His name was Eric. And so I was so enthralled with this poem. It just touched something in me. And then he died like a week later. Mm-hmm. And Michelle, my voice instructor, said, "I want you to write his eulogy for the newspaper." And I was barely a writer. And she said, "Eric would have wanted it this way. He saw something in me." And so at the very same time, my writing path started in earnest and my spiritual path was ignited. And, there's a saying, when the student is ready, the teacher appears. Even though I only knew him for a very minuscule amount of time, he ignited a spark in me that I then needed to pursue. And sometimes, people who are so-called spiritual think that your mission may be some big glorious thing, but it may be igniting someone's path. It may be doing a kindness that prevents someone from, going into a depression, so we don't know the things that, and I say God, but we don't know the things that God wants us to do. And that's why I always, I try to do this through my writing and encouraging writers, but anyone on a spiritual path, the key is to be aware of these signs and not to fight them, because when we fight them, things go awry. When we resonate with the path that we're being given, things just tend to go more smoothly because we're on our path.
Yeah.
So that's when I was ignited. And then it just, again, we could do more shows, which I love being on your shows. But that's when it really started, and I couldn't fight it. Oh, and then I'd go, just like I read in those days, Shirley MacLaine had written a wonderful book called Out on a Limb, which it's just a primer for anybody who's starting to experience the spiritual path. And she received a lot of ridicule at the time, but she opened the door for so many people to accept that, no, this is okay. And then, as she described in the book, I would find these little out of the way bookstores with all of the, esoteric types of books that were of things I couldn't even imagine. And I'd be walking around and a book would fall on my head. Those things really do happen when you're being guided by your guides. And here, this is, I didn't know, I had a dream when I was coming into awareness, and I have not read everything. I've read pieces of things when I've been shown. I had a dream where I literally saw a book stand, a book, and was told by someone in the dream to read the Vedas, which is an ancient Indian text. I had never heard of that. Where did that come from? What's the Vedas? And I had to go look it up. So when we open to these other dimensions and to our spiritual path, we receive guidance, and we just have to pay attention to it.
Yes. And Deborah, I think that you manifested this teacher. I believe in manifestation, and I believe that, for example, since the onset of COVID-19 pandemic, more people are seeking a connection with the universe or God, perhaps due to the realization that material possessions alone do not bring fulfillment. Maybe it's because of this, maybe, I don't know if it's only my impression.
Oh, no, I totally agree with you. And I've actually said this in some of my lectures, and I've talked about how some of these big events that have happened, especially in the last 5-10 years, starting with some of the economic collapse, the situation with Bernie Madoff, then the pandemic, none of these, whether we've manifested them or the universe has said, aha, we need to teach them something because things are getting out of hand. I think these are blessings, even though they're awful. I mean, I just found out, I think the virus is an awful thing, and I don't, I wouldn't wish it on anybody, but everything is always for the good. And there is good in how we all had to shift our perspectives. And in some ways, we've been learning how to care for each other again and take care of people and help people. Certainly the economic crisis leveled the playing field and caused people who thought, oh, nothing will touch me, I'm wealthy, caused them to look and say, no, these are these are only material things in this world, and they can be gone in a minute. You know, what's valuable to us? God, family, friendship. You know, those are the things that make us human and make us evolved humans. So I support your perspective 150%. I'm glad you said it, because it's how I believe as well.
Yeah. So I thought, I said, I have to tell it. So, Deborah, your book, Spiritual Writing from Inspiration to Publication, was originally written in 2002.
No, actually, I looked at it again. It was 2001. It
Wow.
came out, the first edition.
Okay.
And it was ahead of its time. It had to be rewritten. And that's probably why I didn't realize it was even 2001, which the world changed in 2001.
Completely.
I mean, my goodness. And it came out before 9/11. I mean, the world changed that year.
Yes.
And then, you know, flash forward 20 or so years later, I no wonder I had to rewrite it from top to toe. I couldn't keep any of it. I had to change the energy of it. I needed to add all of the new available technologies for writers and different ways of publishing. But I also needed to enhance the spiritual aspects in the book, because I've grown so much. And back then, if you really so-called came clean about your own gifts and your own beliefs, it was not as well received. You know, a lot of people have pioneered this area and have broken ground and paved the way for me to be able, and I didn't even really tell half my story, but for me to even feel comfortable enough to talk about the spiritual path and my own experiences in this way with you. That's huge.
Yeah.
And that's why I want people who are called spiritually, if you can leave your ego at the door and really do this for the betterment of others, to share your voice and not be afraid, because the world is different now. You will be heard.
Yeah, those times no, I think very few people were prepared to read this kind of books, at least before 9/11. What do you think?
Yeah. There back in the late 80s, when I was starting, you know, to seek out these really strange books by these, you know, whether it was Eastern philosophy or just some of these classic authors who talked about changing your thoughts, and or just different spiritual truths. You know, I am Jewish and raised in my Jewish culture, and you know, especially for me, you know, I've learned much more about the mystical aspects of my tradition later in life. But you know, it's a strong culture. It's almost an ethnicity, and uh, uh, even though I always believed in God, and I mean, I would see God in things, and imagine God, and talk to God, you know, and I'm again, I'm blessed because I know people who've had arguments with God, or they've had times when they lost their faith. That was never a problem for me. But I hadn't been exposed to all these other traditions and philosophies. And so for me at that time, you know, I was just hungry for it. And there were very few places where you could find these books. And I used to go to a little out of the way house when I was living in Columbus, Ohio. And anybody from Columbus, Ohio will remember this. It was like out on Sullivan Avenue or something. It's now a big house. It's called Phoenix Books. It's now a big house, more on the main drag. But at that time, it was almost like oh no, what am I doing? I'm doing something naughty. And and then in the late 80s, after Shirley MacLaine wrote her book and a few other people wrote books, there were actual so-called new age bookstores that would bring in all these titles and you could go there. But then it got it got a little weird, because it became fad like. And I always thought that the term new age was, once I really understood what we were talking about, I always thought it was a misnomer, because the real important philosophy was old. It was not new. So we were talking about, decades, millennia, and just going back and back and back of traditions. So it was a very interesting time, and it was a time when these books were coming out of the shadows. And then you saw a flood of people writing about these subjects. And then the publishers were starting to embrace things that were called practical spirituality, or practical, new age. And then, back then you wouldn't have seen all these books about yoga. That wasn't there. And, you weren't going to see, there was a period of time where everybody was writing about angels. And I always use that as an example for writers, because if you're seeing something like that as a trend in mainstream publishing, you're behind the trend, because publishing is always like 18 months. If you see a book on the shelf, there's at least a year to 18 months before that to bring it to the shelves. So I think we're in a wonderful time, because people want change, and they want optimism and hopefulness. And in a spiritual download, when I was, I was just in my late 20s, which I'm not now. I was told that the two most important lessons, and what we would be needing and missing in this, in these years, and during my lifetime, would be hope and love. And I kept that thought as I was working with explaining the 7 lessons. And if you think about it, right now, if you think about darkness and light, darkness, and it's just the absence of light, negativity, it thrives on fear, it thrives on hopelessness, it thrives on despair. And so many of the things that are happening in our world, the divisiveness, the misuse of social media, the bullying, the focus on 15 minutes of fame, the materialism, all of these things create a great environment of hopelessness and fear. And the opposite of those two things would be hope, would also be faith in whatever your faith is, and would also be love. So the greatest lesson that we are here to learn now in these years is about love, and loving each other, and facing our fears, and diffusing fear with faith, with love and hope. And so for spiritual writers, that's your job. Not to scare people, not to take them off their paths, but to bring light, and to bring them this hopefulness that everything is going to be okay, because it is going to be okay. I mean, it is. Everything is for the good, and we're all here just to learn. God has the ultimate control over the outcome, and you can shift your perspective in a day. You could change your mind in a day and look at things differently, and they will be different.
Yes, I love your way to think. Your positivity is contagious. Actually,
Hope so.
and
I mean, I can get grouchy and grumpy, just ask my poor husband, but but as far as what I see as my mission, I maybe one of these days, because you're such a great interviewer and I feel so comfortable with you, I'll tell you about some of my lessons that were hard won. But I went through initiations, spiritual initiations, that caused me to surrender completely to God and to say, I don't care what happens to me, I want to serve. And it was frightening, but it was illuminating, and it was real. And so, even though as a flawed human being, I can eat too much sugar, I can get cranky or whatever. From a spiritual standpoint, when I'm resonating with that part of myself, it is in service, and anything I can do to help people find that light inside of themselves and to fight this pervasive negativity and fear and grief and pain. God never unplugs from us. God is consistent, unconditional love, and is there. I don't believe that God, punishes us and hates us. And, I don't believe that. That's not the God that I know. We unplug. And one of the lessons I talk about in the book is self-love. And that's so huge. It's when we don't feel worthy. So we can love God, we can pray, we could praise, we can sacrifice. But if we don't feel worthy of God's unconditional love, that's going to derail us. And that's unfortunately why, and I hate to even say the word, but that's why we have such a high suicide rate.
yes,
We shouldn't have that. We are responsible for bringing light and love to everyone, no matter what walk of life. And we should be providing, mental health care for people who can't help themselves. And we should be helping each other. That's why we're here.
Yeah. We're all connected.
We are all connected. And when we all get to the other side, boy, big joke, when we see that we are all energy of the same force. And yet we can, look at people and say, well, at least that's not me, not in my neighborhood. I spent some time on the beautiful island of Molokai in Hawaii, and I was working on a book with a woman, and she told me that and I don't know if I'm saying it correctly, but they have a philosophy called malama, where if there are people who can't help themselves or take care of themselves, the community will malama them and help them and take care of them. And there's no shame. Here we, and I know you're not in the US at the moment, correct, right? Well, anyway, I speak for the US. I can't speak for other places in the world, but I know that we attach shame to people who can't help themselves or who need help, and then we wonder, why are things terrible? Look at ourselves. We're not doing our jobs.
Yeah, some people just say, it's not with me. They no, one day we'll reach you. If you don't help, you don't try to change things. It's what I really believe. We are connected. And
we can make changes by putting out positive energy. we can't necessarily go to each person's home. We can't necessarily change the legal, although I'm working with people who are trying to change the legal system. I'm working with an organization called Integrative Law, and they're trying to change law from adversarial to more mediation and agreement. So there are ways that people, maybe that's their mission, can change systems and all of that. But as individuals, we can change our outlook, and we can put more love, acceptance, and positivity into the world. And spiritual writers, you guys ought to get cracking. And I have told you from soup to nuts, not only how to organize your work, how to be a great messenger, but how to get published. And even if you don't get published traditionally, alternatives to traditional publishing. Again, not commercial plugging, but I did a lot of work in this book. You have everything in here. And if you don't have it in here, you at least know the questions to ask, because I've been in the trenches on all sides for 30 years.
30. I feel that your book is like a manual. It's not only a book. Yeah, it's a manual. It can help who is starting now.
Yes.
And even for people who are already writers and want to try to reach another path, or just read your book. I started reading it actually, and I think it will help me a lot with my writing.
Well, I'm so glad. And even if people are already writing, the publishing industry changes so fast. And, I've tried to convey what publishers will and will not do. Because even if you have, at which I have had, the front list, A list, big excitement about a book by a major publisher, there's only a window when they will do promotion for you. So if you want to give your books a bigger life, it is going to always be up to you. And so what I tried to do also, I added a brand new section that wasn't even thought of back when I originally wrote the book, about how to do platform building using technology. And, there are people who have more technical expertise, and you may have to hire someone to do some of that stuff, but you need to know about it and how technology, when properly used, levels the playing field and allows you to find your tribe.
Yes.
They want what you have. Get rid of the insecurity. You have to learn how to write well, so you have to work with editors and be willing. I've had people say to me, but I wrote it this way with these sentences and this meter and this. That's fine if you only want it for yourself. But there are protocols in writing books. There are structural issues, and you need to know what they are. You need to learn. You need to learn your craft. Then you need to learn about the aspects of marketing and publishing. You can't, I don't want to insult pigs because I think they're adorable, but there's an expression, you can't put lipstick on a pig or whatever. But you need a good book. Your book can't stink. And then you can market it. The best marketing plan for a bad book isn't going to do anybody any good.
Yeah. So Deborah, where can our listeners, where can our audience?
Yeah, I thought it was listeners. Then I had to go and brush my hair and
audience. Yeah.
That was actually very comical. Especially I like how you're impressed how quickly I was able to do it. Hey, you get it down to a science. And I have my daughter to thank for that. My youngest daughter is a model, and she took me to get a makeover, and so I have the right lipstick color, and yeah. So I thank you, Jess. You're awesome. So you can find my book really wherever books are sold. It should be in any of your local bookstores. It's certainly at all the online retailers. And if you don't see it, you can request it because it's traditionally distributed and should be available in all of the warehouses. It's there's a first edition which has an orange cover. That's the first edition. If you're curious, you want both, I no longer, that's sold by third-party sellers. If you want that one, I'm happy for you to see the difference. But the book now has a blue cover, matches my nails.
Beautiful. I love blue.
Well, people who have interviewed me asked me, did you make your nails that color on purpose? And I'm saying to myself, look at the color of the nails and the cover. Of course I did it on purpose. Who gets this? I don't even know how I found. I happen to be also, I do visual art, so I'm good with spotting color. I don't even know where I got this nail polish. It matches perfectly. So
perfectly.
Yes, just to put anybody's mind at ease, I did this on purpose. That's why I wear blue nail polish, is to match my book cover. But I really do hope that, the book is also available as an ebook, Kindle book, but only on Amazon. But I really think that for me, I always like a physical book. And that's why we did a print version. I don't read anything without a highlighter.
Yeah, I love
and I hope people highlight all over it.
Yeah, and it's so good to talk with you. So I'll be waiting.
You too. I was just so happy to see your face. You're wonderful. And you're bringing so much positive energy into the world. So I will look forward to when we meet again. Blessings to you, blessings to all of the viewers. And thank you again for letting me dry my hair. I will always love you for that, because I really looked bad. And thank you. Oh, one more thing. I have a network for writers called writersnetworking.com. And, you will have to really make it work for you. But there are all kinds of writers on there and groups. A social network is only as good as the people networking, but it's there, and it's got well over 4,000 members who identify as writers, and I think people will have fun.
Okay, good to know. I will be putting it on the episode. And yes, so Deborah, have a beautiful day. Thank you also to our audience to stick with you, and I wish you all the best. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Deborah, you are just precious.